This is a course about alternatives, and especially institutional alternatives in contemporary societies, and especially the problem of alternatives or of the lack of them as it presents itself to the progressives, that is, the liberals and the leftists generally, those who have identified themselves with the historical project of the reshaping of society in the interests of the broad majority of ordinary men and women. There's no need to take copious notes in this course because all the classes are videotaped, and the videotape will be placed on the course website a few days after each class. Our group is sufficiently small so that we should be able to have intense engagement, and the quality of our experience together will depend very much on your willingness to engage. The reading and writing requirements in the course, as you can see from the syllabus, are light, but the difficulty of the subject matter is formidable. There's no fixed disciplinary background to this course. All branches of knowledge and discourse are potentially pertinent to the problems that we will be discussing. And the lack of a disciplinary background, of a fixed set of ideas to which we can appeal, adds to the difficulty and adds to the charm and the interest of this effort. Now, a premise of my argument, of the argument that I want to develop and discuss with you here, is that on the whole, in the world today, the progressives have no project. For the most part, their project is the project of their conservative adversaries, with a humanizing discount. If you ask what is their project, it often seems that a fair but disturbing answer is that their project is to put a human face on the project of their adversaries. So they appear on the stage of history now as the humanizers of the inevitable. And it is against this situation that my effort here in this course is directed. One of the justifications for attempting to pursue this inquiry in an academic setting is that we cannot discuss alternatives for contemporary societies without dealing with the methodological problem of programmatic argument, that is to say, argument about alternatives. And it turns out, this is a theme to which I'll come back repeatedly throughout the course, we contemporaries, not just we progressives, suffer from a disturbance in our ability to imagine structural change in society. And as a result, we suffer from what you could describe as a programmatic aphasia, a difficulty of thinking and talking about alternatives. Now, in any branch of thought, not just in politics or economics, but in science as well, in natural science, To understand a phenomenon is to understand how it can change. To be able to imagine its transformative variations, to subsume it under a larger set of possibilities. Not the horizon of the speculative and ultimately possible, but the field of the adjacent possible. What are the accessible next steps? That's how we understand any state of affairs in the world. The imagination has two crucial moments. One moment is the moment of distancing from the phenomenon. We step back from the immediate phenomenon. This is what Kant regarded as the hallmark of the imagination. So the image is the memory of a perception. But then the second and decisive moment of the imagination after this distancing is insight into transformative possibility, what I just called the adjacent possible. So we have a problem now in imagining the adjacent possible. There is no set of ideas about society and history on which we can rely. So this problem in contemporary programmatic discourse characteristically manifests itself in the form of an apparent dilemma. I believe it's a false dilemma, but it's a dilemma that strikes us with great force and it threatens to demoralize and inhibit our efforts to think programmatically. So here's how the dilemma appears in our contemporary experience. I propose to you something that's very distant from what exists as an alternative. And you say, well, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. Then I propose to you something that's very close to what exists, and you say, well, that's feasible, but it's trivial. In the present climate of opinion, almost anything that we can propose by way of alternatives is likely to appear to be either utopian or trivial. Now, this dilemma arises in the first instance from a misunderstanding about the nature of a programmatic argument. A programmatic argument is not about blueprints. It's about successions. It's not architecture. It's music. And any trajectory of transformation that is worth thinking about can be described at a point that's relatively close to what exists or relatively far from what exists. It's not the relative moderation or extremism of the proposal that distinguishes it. It's the direction. And in any programmatic argument, the two most important attributes are first, that it mark a direction, and second, that it identify in the historical circumstance in which we find it ourselves initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. This misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument is aggravated by a crucial feature of the history of ideas about society and its transformation, and especially the ideas that have most influenced the progressives over the last 2 centuries. So the ideas that had the greatest influence on the thought of the liberals and the leftists, and more generally the progressives, were the ideas expressed in classical European social theory, and especially in doctrines like Marxism. So those doctrines held that there is in history a limited list or menu of alternative regimes, like the modes of production in Karl Marx's theory of society: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. They believed that each of these regimes is an indivisible system. So basically, there are only two kinds of politics. One kind is the revolutionary substitution of one system by another system. And the other kind is the reformist management or humanization of one of these systems. It's this binary idea of politics. And a third principle of this tradition of classical social theory is that there are laws of historical change governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible regimes in history. Now, I believe, and this is a subject to discuss later in the course, that all of these assumptions are false. None of them is true. There isn't a limited menu of alternative regimes. The regimes that exist are not indivisible systems. And these laws of historical change don't exist. But whether or not I'm correct in my claim that these views are false, it seems to be a fact that they are no longer widely believed. The progressives have trouble believing these ideas, persuading themselves of their veracity. But what's the alternative to them? The problem is that there seem to be no clear alternatives to them. The dominant spirit of contemporary positive social science and policy discourse is a normalization or naturalization of social life, presenting the dominant arrangements of the contemporary societies as if they were somehow the natural or necessary outcome of a long evolutionary sequence. And those ideas then in contemporary society seem to deny us any position from which we could challenge the established regimes. So we have no credible set of ideas about structural change. The ideas that appear to be structural, like Marxism, have become unbelievable. And the alternative ideas that are now in command of the social sciences are anti-structural. They're normalizing or naturalizing ideas. And this striking feature of the intellectual background to contemporary debates about society greatly aggravates the force of that dilemma. Because here's what happens if we don't have a reliable view of how to think about structural change and structural alternatives. We fall back on a surrogate criterion of political realism, which is proximity to what exists. So then we come to think that a proposal is realistic if it's close to what exists, and it's not realistic if it's far from what exists. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a criterion of political realism. That's not the expression of an idea about transformation. That's just a kind of declaration of intellectual bankruptcy. We don't have an understanding of structural change. And so we think, well, it's more realistic if it's similar to what already exists, and it's not realistic if it's different from what exists. And then we get to this dilemma. So in attempting to seize forcefully on this subject matter of what are the alternatives, and to go beyond the humanizing perspective, the idea that all the progressives can do is put a human face on the project of their conservative adversaries, we immediately find ourselves entangled in this circumstance of intellectual confusion that we somehow have to struggle with. And I think that that fact is one of the fundamental justifications for dealing with this subject matter in an academic setting at a distance from the immediate context of politics, in the main theater of political struggle, which is the nation state. Now, that's all just by way of preliminary, and my plan for today's first class is to set the stage for our inquiry in the course, and to do so by dealing with three themes. The first theme is what I want to call the dictatorship of no alternatives in the world, and I will make some brief remarks about that. The apparent absence of alternatives, of structural alternatives. The second theme is then to describe in detail the predicament of the contemporary progressives. And then the third theme is to outline some features of the perspective from which I propose to address this predicament during the semester. But let me stop there before going any further ahead and ask you whether someone would like to speak to this dilemma as I described it, that everything that can be proposed is either utopian or trivial, and the resulting reliance on proximity to the existence as the fake criterion of political realism.
I think that you described very well a phenomenon that we saw in history of two branches of socialism. One branch is the social democracy, and some maybe even Keynesian socialism, and the other branch is the revolutionary communist ideas. And there's real problem with it, because sometimes when you look at capitalism, I'm talking as a socialist, I see phenomena that I envy, of people who invent stuff that can really change the world, but when you get into the socialist idea, you look at it as unable to divide it.
Because it's a system.
It's a system. So you can't take the good stuff from the current society and build between the gaps of the good stuff other ideas. You must take it or leave it. Our way or the highway. And it's a problem, because it's very, very paralyzing from the intellectual point.
Yeah. So, but now what's most common after the calamities and misadventures of the 20th century is that this systemic alternative is not in fact available. So we now have this situation in the world, that many countries around the world are governed by ex-revolutionaries, ex-Marxists. And they think in the following way: real change, so-called systemic or structural change, would be the replacement of one of these systems by another system, like capitalism by socialism. That's not in the cards. It's not feasible. If it were feasible, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to administer the existing regime and humanize it. If you're not a revolutionary, if you're not a romantic, if you're a disenchanted ex or post-revolutionary, what's left to do is to administer and humanize the existing regime. In this way of thinking, the idea of revolution, which is an expression of that tradition of classical social theory, that there are these regimes and that each of them is indivisible, becomes an alibi for its opposite. This seems to be a large part of the function today of the idea of revolution. It's turned on its head. So that's what real change would be. But real change is not available. So we have to do this other thing. And the other thing is then the management. So the premise of this argument is that fragmentary change, piecemeal change, change that's not systemic, is not fundamental change. Fundamental change is the wholesale replacement of one system by another. And fundamental change is not possible on this view. Now, I think this set of assumptions is also false. There is no such there's no such closed list of regimes. The regimes that exist are not indivisible. There's no contradiction between the piecemeal character of change and its horizon of fundamental transformation. So these claims are all hopeful claims, but I have to make them out. But we start in a very deep hole, right? Because the situation is the situation of this intellectual confusion, which now penetrates the whole discourse of politics. That's the starting point. And I think we have to see that situation straightforwardly and courageously and deal with it, and not deceive ourselves into thinking that there's some ready-made, simple solution to that problem. You know, to state the problem in those terms is already to begin to change the way you think, because then we're trying to grasp the situation as a whole. Hegel said, philosophy is revolutionary even when it appears to be reactionary. It's because of this. It's because then we begin to represent the situation as a whole and to make sense of it on terms that are not the terms of our immediate experience. Any other comment on this dilemma? So, yes.
I'm wondering if this dilemma is globally true, though. So the first country that comes to my mind might be Finland, that is actually proud of being progressive, is trying out things like basic minimum income, and arguably this is a step into a fundamental change of how societal and economic structures are. Because the progressives there have a different version of themselves comparative to the US. I would say that this overarching statement is a little oversimplified. And I acknowledge your problem and the problem that you're stating, but equalizing the US, Brazil, and Finland with one another is strongly oversimplified.
So this is very interesting because this comes up in the course of the theme that I now want to take to address, which is this dictatorship of no alternatives. It's true that Scandinavian social democracy in general is the most widely admired regime in the world. And a question to address is whether it does represent or not an innovation.
I'm not talking about Scandinavian social democracy. That's fairly static at this point. I'm specifically talking about Finland and the innovation of introducing unconditional basic income, which is in my idea. So at least that's
yes, but several of the Scandinavian countries have experimented with one form or another. The Swedes certainly think they have a distinct model under the label of flex security. And so this is a variation, and we should indeed discuss whether the so-called Nordic model represents a supersession of the dictatorship of no alternatives. So the dictatorship of no alternatives, the first thing. There is now in the world a very limited range of live options in the organization of different parts of social life. The way of organizing a market economy, of organizing a democratic state, of organizing the relation of the state to civil society or of the state to the family. A very small list of living alternatives. And that limited set of options is, you could say, the fate of the contemporary societies. In each of these domains of social life, our ideals and interests are nailed to the cross of a very narrow set of institutions and practices. The law is the site of this crucifixion because the detailed institutional arrangements of society are not manifest simply or primarily as ideological abstractions like the market economy or capitalism, but in detailed institutional form, and therefore in their legal expression. The last major moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the political and economic experience of the rich North Atlantic democracies happened in the middle of the 20th century. It was what in the European discourse you could describe as the social democratic or the social liberal settlement, prefigured by initiatives before the Second World War. And in the United States, it took the form of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. That was the American counterpart to European social democracy and social liberalism. How are we to understand the basic character of this settlement of the mid-20th century, which is the origin, the prehistory of the present dictatorship of no alternatives? One way to understand it is to think of it as a kind of bargain or exchange. The forces that challenged the established organization of power and of production renounced this challenge. And in return for this renunciation, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to redistribute after the fact through progressive taxation and social entitlements, and to manage the economy countercyclically through monetary and fiscal policy, evening out the economic slumps. So an essential feature of this social democratic settlement was the abandonment of the attempt to reinvent the basic character of the market economy. And many themes that were in contest in an earlier moment of political and economic struggle ceased to be the object of active struggle. Let me give you an example from a long list. In the 19th century, up to the middle of the 19th century, it was an almost universal belief of liberals as well as socialists, of John Stuart Mill and Abraham Lincoln, as well as of Karl Marx, that wage labor was a defective and transitory form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. And that in a free society, wage labor would have to give way over time to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. This belief was really only abandoned in the late 19th century. And it was only in the course of the 20th century, that is, very recently, contrary to our assumption, that the predominance of economically dependent wage labor as the primary form of free labor was naturalized. And we could make a long list of themes like that, that were open then, but then ceased to be open as a result of what I'm calling this social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century. So that's the fundamental historical background to what I'm calling the dictatorship of no alternatives. This very small range of live options in the experience of the contemporary societies, especially of the rich democracies of the North Atlantic world. In this circumstance now, in the decades following the establishment of this social democratic compromise, the fundamental project of the governing elites in the rich North Atlantic countries has become to reconcile American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. So, in other words, to render the market social while liberalizing social democracy. That's become the dominant project of the North Atlantic elites. And there are then a series of significant but limited innovations, like the one that you addressed, that take place in this context. So we can discuss later in the course whether this represents the beginning of an unraveling or overcoming of what I'm calling the dictatorship of no alternatives, or whether it's only an excessively limited adjustment. But here is the claim now that I want to make with respect to this theme of the dictatorship of no alternatives. the contemporary societies face a series of problems, of structural problems, that cannot be adequately solved or even addressed within the limits of the social democratic compromise of the mid-20th century, or of its Nordic flexibilization. So let me just give you two examples of these problems, of fundamental problems that cannot be addressed unless we reopen the terms of the social democratic compromise. One problem is the hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward parts of production. So there is now a change in the character of the most advanced practice of production. There is a new practice of production, sometimes called post-Fordist or the new economy, but perhaps most tellingly labeled the knowledge economy. We often associate it just with high technology industry. But the truth is that it appears as a fringe in every sector of the economy. Not just in high-tech industry, but also in knowledge-intensive services and in precision or scientific agriculture. But in each sector of the economy, it is a fringe that excludes the vast majority of the labor force. It is confined, it is quarantined to a very limited part of the economy. So then you might say, this is a fundamental cause of economic stagnation. There's an attempt now in these societies to make the slowing of the rate of economic growth or of the rise of productivity seem natural on the pretense that the contemporary technological innovations are somehow less revolutionary than the innovations of 100 years ago. But the alternative explanation is that the most productive practice is denied to the vast majority of firms and of workers. How could there not be stagnation if the practice that's most productive is quarantined in a narrow fringe of the economy? And similarly, you could say that this hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward sectors then becomes a motor for the creation of inequality. The inequality is anchored in the structure of the economy. Now, there are two traditional devices for the moderation of inequality. One of them is compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, that is to say, by progressive taxation and social entitlements. And the other is the defense of small business or small property against big business and big property. But it seems that these two traditional devices for the moderation of inequality are inadequate to deal with the vast differentials of advantage and opportunity, of wealth and of income that arise from this hierarchical segmentation of the economy, from these structural divisions between the advanced and backward sectors. We can't resolve that problem within the limits of the social democratic compromise. We would have to reshape the market order and deal with all of the requirements for the widespread diffusion of the most advanced practice of production. Now let me give you a second example. You could say that all of the democracies that exist in the world are, in a sense, weak democracies. They're democracies in which the people, the citizens, delegate political activity to a cadre of professional politicians. And the law, legislation, as the expression of politics, is then a series just of episodic changes in the established arrangements. The sovereign goes to sleep and is awoken only when there is crisis. And crisis in these societies takes traditionally one of two forms: economic ruin or war. So then we have the fundamental rhythm of the European societies in the 20th century. When there's war, they wake up. And there's structural change in the wake of war. And then, when universal peace is reestablished, they go back to sleep and drown their sorrows in consumption. And the horizon of politics is dramatically narrowed. So one of the criteria by which to determine the vitality of a form of national political life is the extent to which it makes change depend on crisis. How can political life be organized in a way that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, and therefore weakens or overthrows the rule of the living by the dead? So that there could be a constant experiment, an ability to put the structure to the test that did not require trauma to be its enabling condition. Now, that's another example of a problem that lies totally beyond the field of the social democratic compromise. So this is the dictatorship of no alternatives in the rich part of the world. Now let's look at the rest of the world, the vast periphery. Because you might think that in the rest of the world, there would be rebellion against the dictatorship of no alternatives. The rest of the world is seething. So the menu of options in the rest of the world should be much larger, but it isn't. Because if we look then in the rest of the world and we look to see whether there are fundamental augmentations of this narrow range of options, find that basically there aren't. The main feature that's present in the continental developing countries, emerging economies, the BRICS countries, is state capitalism. Not a radical change in the situation that I've described. Now, it seems that their potential for rebellion, for apostasy from the dictatorship of no alternatives is neutralized on the one side by the constraints on democracy, on national political life, and on the other side by the poverty of ideas. So each of these great countries, China, India, Russia, Brazil, is bent under the yoke of mental colonialism. So you look at the intellectual life, the debates of the intelligentsia in those societies, this vast periphery, and you see there are two main elements. One element is a fossilized and shrunken Marxism, only half believed in by its would-be votaries. So it's like they've taken from the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist, an axe. They've cut Marxism in half. They've thrown away the good part, the transformative aspirations, and they've kept the bad part, the historical fatalism. That's half of it. And the other half is the imitation of American-style social science and policy discourse, especially economics, in the spirit of the retrospective rationalization of the existent. So the dictatorship of no alternatives in the rest of the world, in the periphery, is not subject to challenge, given these political and intellectual constraints. But at the same time, there are features of the situation that suggest that this dictatorship of no alternatives is subject to overthrow or reversal. It has the features of a so-called chaotic situation because it's on its surface stagnant. But there's vast disquietude, restlessness, ambition underneath. The whole world is now connected. Every part of the world is in communion with every other part. And any deviation from the dictatorship of no alternatives that seem to be promising and that could be represented under the prism of a discourse resonating throughout the world could have a sensational effect. There have to be two elements. There have to be tangible experiments that could be seen as down payments on some alternative. And these tangible experiments then have to be represented in the light of some set of ideas. There has to be a doctrine, because no experiment is powerful as an inspiration for change unless it can be seen as an instance of some project. And the project has to be stated in some doctrinal form. So this is the dictatorship of no alternatives. I've just tried to evoke it now by a first approximation. This very limited list of options, and then the presence of problems that can't be resolved within the limits of the dictatorship of no alternatives. Now, I gave two examples. I gave fundamental examples. But I could have given much more limited examples also of, let me give you two other examples, which might seem less revolutionary, but also suggest the limits of the dictatorship of no alternatives. Take the relation between finance and the real economy. In all the existing market economies in the world, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. the funding of the production of the productive agenda of society is largely generated within the production system itself. Well, what then is the purpose of all of that money that's traded in the stock markets or held in the banks? Theoretically, it's to fund the productive agenda of society. In fact, it seems that the vast preponderance of liquid capital has only an oblique or episodic relation to the funding of the productive agenda of society. And the situation, therefore, is that in good times, finance is largely indifferent to the real economy, and in bad times, it becomes destructive. Well, does it have to be this way? We can imagine the market economy being reformed or reshaped to change the relation between finance and the real economy. It's happened many times before in history. For example, in the first half of the 19th century, one of the central political economic struggles in the United States was the struggle over the national bank. And it culminated during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States. And for over 100 years, all banks operating in more than one state of the Union were prohibited in the United States. And the Americans developed the most decentralized system of credit at the service of the local producer that had ever existed in the world. When they did this, they were not regulating the financial markets. They were inventing a kind of capital market that hadn't existed before. So there's nothing natural about the situation that I've described, the situation in which the use of finance to fund the creation of new assets in new ways, as for example in venture capital, is a minuscule part of financial activity. And there's very little organic relation between finance and the real economy. Now let me give you another example. Taking the European societies as the setting for the argument. In the contemporary social democracies, the primary instrument for social solidarity are money transfers organized by the state. The state taxes the people who have more, and then it uses that money to fund social entitlements. But money is a very weak social cement. And its weakness as an instrument of social cohesion becomes manifest to the extent that the level of social and cultural homogeneity in society decreases. So if you have a society that's like a big tribe, everyone is like everyone else. The fundamental basis of social solidarity, of cohesion, is that homogeneity, that tribal character of society. Now open the gates of immigration and begin to undermine, to diminish this level of homogeneity. The insufficiency of money as a social cement will then become manifest. And you'll have to invent another basis of social solidarity. For example, some form of social service, direct engagement of people in helping to take care of one another beyond the boundaries of their own family. So I've now given 4 examples of problems, I'm calling them structural problems, in the experience of the contemporary societies that cannot be addressed without major institutional innovation. The consequences of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, the confinement of the most advanced practice to fringes, the dependence of change on crisis in politics, the relation of finance to the real economy, and the practical basis of social cohesion. None of this can be addressed within the limits of the social democratic compromise. So then we have to begin to have alternatives. But the discourse of alternatives in the history of progressive and leftist politics is a discourse about these systemic options, like socialism is the alternative to capitalism, these systems that no one believes in anymore. So that's the problem. That's the problem presented by what I'm calling the dictatorship of no alternatives. We need structural alternatives, but we can't think about structural alternatives in the way in which we used to think about them. And we don't yet know what the other way is. So that's all I wanted to say for the moment about the dictatorship of no alternatives. Comments about this?
I have a question. So,
Yes.
You say it's like structurally set that
Yes.
people can't be creative about change. But isn't it that people are just, they look for like good enough options, and it's, I mean, like they're very there's like a stickiness, right? Like, you know, like the QWERTY keyboard or the daylight savings or the electoral college. You know, people are just, you know, they think there needs to be change, but they're not willing to give up enough to do that change. And it feels like it's not so much structural, it's just people look for, they weigh options and, you know, maybe the amount of effort they have to put in to make this change. And if it's not reasonable, the effort is not reasonable, then they just, you know, they just stay with the good enough option. And I feel that maybe it's kind of embedded in human nature. Just according to, you know, a lot of things that should be changing.
So isn't it the case that a large part of the answer to the question that you raise must have to do with the extent to which these alternatives can be broken up into pieces or steps? So it doesn't seem like there's a huge jump from accepting things as they are to projecting yourself into another world. That was part of what I was trying to get at before when I was speaking about this, what I described as this false binary idea of politics. You either manage the present system or you replace it by another system, which is already predetermined. But real structural change can't be like that. Real structural change has to present itself in piecemeal, fragmentary, but cumulative form. And that's the only way in which it could become real. But at the end of the day, it seems that we have to confront the issue of what works, this, in the spirit of your question.
The step-by-step change is realistic, but people don't like step-by-step change.
As opposed to what?
You know,
As opposed to no change or opposed to to radical change?
Radical change, because people just, I mean, my parents' country is South Korea. They recently elected a president, and the president said like a lot of progressive ideas, like probably revolutionary, but it's not. A lot of it is not achievable, in my idea, and it's just constant battle of selling something that you can't possibly make. And then, people vote for it only when it's something very dreamy. Like if I say oh, maybe I'll lower or increase the tax by some percentage or lower it by some percentage.
So now this is interesting. This, when you say, because they want it because it's dreamy, but they don't believe in it. So this is, let's stop for a moment to think about this, because this has to do with a certain rhetorical choices about method that we have to make in an argument like this. So remember when I was discussing that false dilemma of everything seeming to be either trivial or utopian. I said the way to think about a programmatic argument is to think about it as a direction, trajectory. And if it's worth thinking about, you can describe it at points that are close or points that are far away. Now, when our interest is in intellectual clarification, especially clarification for ourselves, it's not the attempt to persuade other people. We have to persuade ourselves before we persuade anyone else. It will often be the case that it makes sense to focus on a point in the trajectory of transformation that is neither very close to what exists nor very far from what exists. That's at an intermediate level. Because these positions that are intermediate will characteristically be the most revealing of the direction. But they have a disadvantage in practical politics. The disadvantage is that these proposals that seem to be neither very close nor very far away are likely to seem too close to what exists to arouse fervor, enthusiasm, and too far away to be feasible. And so what happens in the discourse of practical politics is that in the discourse of practical politics, we ordinarily prefer to combine the very close to the very far away. So the discourse of transformative politics is both practical and prophetic, as opposed to categorical or scholastic. And this is important to say this, because here in these arguments, in which we're distant from the practical politics, I'm not going to emphasize the practical and the prophetic. I'm going to emphasize this middle point, just because I think that it is the most revealing. But we have to understand that that's not the discussion that we would have in practical politics, where we would prefer the very close and the very far away. Yes?
So this strikes me as an important place for the two preconditions needed for change that you discussed to be in dialogue with each other. You mentioned tangible experiments that are down payments
Yes.
on alternatives, and you mentioned articulation and doctrine.
Yes.
These seem like, the way that these two interplay seem like they can address some of the near-far issues that we're contending with. Can you think of prominent examples of one without the other, where there might be experiments minus doctrine, doctrine minus experiments, where something is not taking root that could otherwise be if they were both?
Well, the marriage is never perfect, right? But this was the discourse of the 19th century. So liberalism and socialism in the 19th century were worldwide doctrines. And then there were experiments in particular countries, which were then represented as instances or down payments of these doctrines. Now, It's not the way the progressives think today. For example, in practical political economy, a very common view of the progressives is that the orthodoxy, call it neoliberalism or the Washington consensus, is universal. But the heresies are local. So the way the progressives think now is that there's a universal orthodoxy, and they will resist this universal orthodoxy through a set of local heretical adaptations. Each local heresy will combine elements of the orthodoxy with provincial deviations from it. Now, I'll just make a practical point. A universal orthodoxy cannot be successfully combated by a local heresy. Only a universalizing heresy, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century, can successfully combat a universal orthodoxy. So this is an indirect response to your remark. The two elements of the doctrine, which must be a universal doctrine, universalizing. It's not just a doctrine for one country. And of examples, which are necessarily examples in particular countries. These two have to be combined for the alternative to be potent. And they were combined before, but we no longer know how to combine them. And because we no longer believe in some of the 19th century assumptions, that there are these systems, that there's a predetermined script. So this is a profound aspect of our situation, which I think is not understood. If we want to go beyond the dictatorship of no alternatives and think structurally and think about structural alternatives, we have to have institutional proposals. So a basic idea here in the argument of this course is that we need to generate a fundamental shift in the terms of the ideological debate. The dominant model of ideological contest over the last 2 centuries was a kind of hydraulic model focused on the contest between the state and the market. More market, less state. More state, less market. Synthesis of market and state. Assuming that the market has a predetermined institutional form, which it does not. Or that there's a natural institutional form of democracy. Now we have to imagine a different mode of ideological discourse in which we come to think that democracy, the market, and an independent civil society can have radically different institutional forms. So economic, political, and social pluralism have no natural and necessary institutional form. And the solution to all of the structural problems depends on the creation of alternative institutional forms of economic, political, and social pluralism. Then we have a different debate. That's the debate which I want to argue we would need in the world and that we don't have. So that's another way to mark this division of where we would need to go. Now, I'm describing the situation in a way that may seem menacing, but actually I think it's immensely hopeful because the world is looking, the world is ready, the world is restless. And we haven't formulated the terms. And the impression that history is at an end, that there are no alternatives, would suddenly change if we were able to produce this marriage of concrete example to universalizing doctrine, which is the key to a change in the situation. Now, I would go on to my second theme, if you don't have another engagement, and that's the predicament then. I just want to go one step down in further detail to explore the predicament of the progressives on 4 dimensions. So the first problem is the problem of their confusion about the message. So in a nutshell, here's one way of describing the problem about the message. On the whole, they have ceased to believe in the adequacy of statism, of the governmental control and direction of the economy. But they understand, or they half understand, that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer is not enough. So that's an initial statement of the problem. Statism is unbelievable or undesirable, but tax and transfer are not sufficient. So what shall they stand for? They would need to have a different idea of the institutional organization of the market economy. Now, one of the most important ways in which this confusion about the message manifests itself is in the relation to the idea of progressive taxation. So when the progressive politicians or the progressive ideologists don't know what to propose, they propose progressive taxation. Now, there's a problem. The problem is that there's an enormous amount of empirical evidence to suggest that progressive taxation of income and wealth, to the extent that it's feasible in these economies and societies, has only a marginal effect on the distribution of economic advantage. To have more than a marginal effect, it would have to be vast and radical. And then it would begin to disorganize the economy on the way in which the economy is now constituted. So you could say the first principle is that what matters most with respect to economic inequality are the institutional arrangements that determine the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity. Economic opportunity and educational opportunity. Everything else is secondary. That's what matters most. Then you come to the second principle. Well, it doesn't mean that the system of taxation and entitlements has no significance. It has an accessory significance. But what matters most with respect to the budget on both the revenue-raising side and the spending side is not how progressive the tax system is on the revenue-raising side. It's the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. So take the following paradox about contemporary fiscal experience, which is anathema to the progressives. On paper, the most progressive tax system in the North Atlantic world is the tax system of the United States, which is by far the most unequal of these rich North Atlantic democracies. The European social democracies have tax systems that are on the whole based fundamentally on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or the closest functional equivalent to it. Now, how can you explain this? That the more equal societies have a tax system that is regressive, and the more unequal society has a tax system that on paper is more progressive. The answer is that in the short term, what matters most with respect to the tax system is not how progressive the taxes are. It's what the aggregate level of the tax take is. So the basic reason why the European budgetary systems are on the whole more progressive is very simple. They take at least 10% more of GDP in taxes. And they spend it in social entitlements, in investment in people and their capabilities. That's the basis of their social compact. And then what's lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending side. But this is very complicated, very dialectical. So you're more progressive by being more regressive. So what the politicians do on the whole is not having a structural program. They genuflect to the pieties of progressive taxation as a way to show whose side they are, on whose side they are, even though they know that these claims of progressive taxation are entirely marginal in their practical effects. So the confusion about the message. The confusion about the message is that there's no structural program. There's no program about the reorganization of the market economy to influence the primary distribution of advantage. And then the space is occupied by the secondary discussion of correcting after the fact through progressive taxation and social entitlements the original distribution. Well, it's totally secondary. So let me give you another example. We were talking about the Scandinavian countries. So in my country, in Brazil, we have many political parties, but we basically only have one idea in our national politics, which you could call tropical Sweden. So all the politicians pretend to be center-left, almost all of them, social liberals or social democrats. And the primary theme of the discourse of politics is the distribution of the sugar. So what's the sugar? The sugar is the social. Sugarcoat the pill of the economic model. And it'll be like Sweden in the tropics. Now, that's not the real Sweden, because in the real Sweden, there were many decades of struggle between the state and the dynastic plutocracy of the country, which ended in a kind of compromise in which the state expropriated some of the power of these families that own most of the Swedish economy, but let them remain in control, in a qualified control. That was the real narrative. It was a struggle over economic and political power. Then at the end comes the system of entitlements, which is sort of the epilogue. Now, the Brazilians, like a great part of the world, want to have just the epilogue without all of the narrative that came before it, which is the struggle over the institutional arrangements. And this describes, again, this is just another way of describing the confusion about the message. So the fundamental troubling characteristic of the message, or of the absence of the message, is this lack of structural content. It would have to be about that. It would have to be about reorganizing the arrangements that determine the primary distribution of economic and educational opportunity. And to do that, we have to have this discussion that says it's not just the replacement of one system by another, because there isn't any other system waiting in the wings to be established. Yes?
So I see contradiction here that I can't make sense of. You talk that transformation in institutions is something that shouldn't come by a crisis.
Shouldn't come by?
A crisis, by war or economical mishap. And then you talk that it's a fact of life. No one will give you the power that they hold voluntarily. So I think that the elites in some of the countries, if we start some kind of transitional transformation, like the last one was the NEP in Russia, which was not in the issues of taxation, it will be a war. And from my history that I read, the classes that hold the power will make that war. So we can't make that transition without a fight. So what is the limits of that fight?
Well, so there's let me say, in presenting my claim about crisis and change, there's the following paradox, which is implicit in your remarks just now. I say we need institutions that diminish the dependence of change on crisis. For example, a higher energy democracy with more popular engagement, constitutional mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse, and so forth. But then you could say that the establishment of these institutions that diminish the dependence of change on crisis itself depends on crisis. And this is the vicious circle that has to be broken. And there's no simple way to break it, right? On one side, there's the role of ideas, and we hope that imagination will do the work of crisis without crisis. But on the other hand, there's the work of developing a constituency, a practical basis, which is then just the reverse side of the alternative program. So, for example, take an issue in practical politics, which is of immense significance to the progressives, which is the attitude and political position of the small business class, of what you could call the petty bourgeoisie, the petty entrepreneurs, the small-scale proprietors, objectively a very important part of the economy, of the society, and subjectively even more important, because the majority of humanity has a petty bourgeois perspective, a horizon. It aspires to modest prosperity and independence. Now, in Europe, in the period between the wars, the left elected the petty bourgeoisie as its enemy. This was a fatal mistake, because then this class became the mainstay of the right-wing movements, having been demonized by the left. So the circumstance of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy has among its victims not just the traditional working class, but the small business class, the small proprietors, the underclass, and so forth. So it's necessary to conceive a project that in its political economic content, but also in its strategies for the development of coalition or alliance, produces a convergence of these groups, reinterprets their interests and identities in a way that begins to conceive of them as allies, rather than as, and that must be another part of the solution to the problem that you that you described. I'm not saying that it's an easy solution, but it seems to me that that's at least the beginning of a response to your question. So that actually is the second feature or the second dimension of this predicament of the progressives. And that has to do with their base. So again, here's a description in a nutshell of the problem of the progressives with respect to their base. The historical constituency of the left and left-leaning political forces was organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, especially in mass production industry. That was the historical basis of the socialist, social democratic, and labor parties in the Western countries. Now it turns out that this historical constituency is a shrinking part of the population because of the decline of mass production industry. And this shrinking part of the population comes to be seen by the rest of society and ultimately comes to see itself not as the bearer of the universal interests of the majority, but as just one special interest group, as a lobby. So it's not a feasible base for the left parties. So then what do the left parties imagine? That they say, well, we'll cut our links with this historical base, and what will then our base be? Would be a kind of generic, middle-class, quality-of-life party? We'll be left without a base unless they invent another base. So this is the second aspect. So they're confused about the message, and they're confused about their base, about their constituency. They would have to have the project of forming an alternative base that would include not just the traditional working class, but the underclass and the small business class, and the technical and professional cadres in society. Because without that, they have no feasible project. Now then comes the third aspect of their predicament. So the first aspect is the message. They're confused about the message. Has no structural content. The second aspect is the base. Their traditional base is no longer adequate, but there's no obvious alternative base. The third element of the predicament is this problem of crisis that you mentioned. There is no crisis of adequate dimension to their historical purposes, like the Depression of the 1930s or the Second World War. The crises are contained or moderate, like the financial and economic crisis of 2007 and 2009, which they were unable to use to advantage. The general political after effect of the crisis of 2008, it favored the right more than it favored the left. So they haven't taught themselves how to dispense with major crisis as the condition of structural change. And then the fourth element in their predicament has to do with the ideas. Well, that was the story that we were discussing before. So the intellectual background is this classical social theoretical vision, as in Marxism, that there are systems, the modes of production or the regimes. Each of them is indivisible, and there are historical laws. All false. History has shown that these beliefs are false, and the progressives have increasing trouble in persuading themselves of these ideas. So but they continue to use the vocabulary. So, for example, the concept of capitalism makes sense in the context of Marxist social and economic theory. But what happens now is that they use the vocabulary without believing in its assumptions. There's a system, capitalism, but there isn't a system. And so the vocabulary is mendacious. It's a form of self-deception, which aggravates this circumstance of confusion that they're in. So, stated again in a nutshell, the problem of ideas is this. There was a social theoretical tradition that offered a way to think about structure, structural alternatives and structural discontinuity in history, but it's no longer believable. The alternative to that social theoretical tradition, which is contemporary social science, is anti-structural. And it has no idea, it has no imagination of structural alternatives or structural discontinuity. And its overwhelming tendency is to naturalize the established arrangements of the contemporary societies. So this is now an evocation of the predicament of the progressives. I described the dictatorship of no alternatives, and then the situation of the progressives with respect to the message, the base, the crisis, the missing crisis, and the missing ideas. So as they would say, it's no accident that they're confused now. Yes?
Can I ask, why is it that they don't believe in the assumptions of the theoretical background? Do you think there's some truth to, Richard Rorty said that had there never been communism, there may in fact be socialism in America today. Is there anything to that idea of disbelief coming from kind of residual Red Scare?
But which socialism? You mean the state control or state, an economy in which the commanding heights of production are occupied by the state?
I'm just talking about you talked about the assumptions of the theoretical background.
So the assumption, that's right.
The assumptions not being believable. What makes them unbelievable, do you think?
Everything in practical experience and in historical learning. History doesn't work that way. That is, real structural change in history does not take the form of these systemic substitutions. Real structural change is fragmentary. The total substitution is the limiting case. But it's not the ordinary form of transformation. So let me go back to the first half of the 19th century in the United States, because the most useful is to give not speculative examples of what might be, but examples of what actually happened. So I gave the example of finance in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. The Americans reorganized finance and changed the relation of finance to the real economy. This was a structural innovation in the market order. Now, let me give you the second example, agriculture. A belief shared in the 19th century, up to the middle of the 19th century, by Marxists and conservatives was that agrarian concentration was an intrinsic and inevitable feature of so-called capitalism. There would be aggregation of land holdings in large plots of agribusinesses. The former peasants would be driven into the cities, and they would become workers. And the right and the left shared this view. This was part of the system, of the structural necessity. Now, the Americans rejected that. And not only did they distribute the land on the agrarian frontier under the Homestead Acts, but they organized a system of decentralized partnership between the government and the family farmers to protect family-scale agriculture against its unique difficulty, which is the combination of climate volatility with economic volatility, price risk and natural risk. So they organized a system of agricultural extension, of price supports, of food stockpiles, of agricultural insurance as the basis for modern, business-oriented, family-scale agriculture in the United States. And they combined that with what in today's vocabulary we would call cooperative competition among the family farmers. The family farmers competed against one another, but they also shared resources and shared labor to achieve economies of scale while preserving decentralized competition. When the Americans did this in agriculture, they weren't regulating the agricultural market, and they weren't compensating after the fact for inequalities in the agricultural market through retrospective redistribution. They were creating a kind of agricultural market that had not existed before. So the premise of a large part of the contemporary debates is that there are basically only two things you can do with a market economy. You can regulate it, or you can compensate for the inequalities after the fact that it generates through retrospective redistribution, as in progressive taxation. But there's actually a third thing that you can do with a market economy, which is much more important. You can change it. You can change how it's organized, and in a fashion that influences the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity. That's what they did in finance and in agriculture. So it's not as if the idea of structural alternatives were some kind of fiction or speculation. It's meant to be an account of how structural change actually happens in history. So the answer to your question is why do they have trouble believing in the assumptions of these deep structure theories? The basic answer is because things don't happen that way. That's not how structural change actually happens. And when you act on those social theoretical assumptions, you suffer political defeat. That's the price of illusion in politics. So that's the basic answer. So we have in the background these two attitudes, right, which are pernicious. One attitude is there's a system. History has a plot, a script. And politics is either reformist or revolutionary. And there's no role for programmatic thinking because the project is supplied by history. It's already been written. We're just the agents to carry it out. That's one view, which I'm arguing is a dead end. The other view is the view taken in contemporary social science and policy discourse, which is a kind of unidimensional view. There are no alternatives. There's just tinkering at the margins to solve a series of discrete practical problems. Politics is a bunch of issues, of problems, and of discrete technical solutions to them. So there's the negotiation among conflicting interests, and there's the technical solution of problems. But there are no structural alternatives. So though it's all insight into the programmatic possibilities begins when we go beyond those two positions. And that's the difficulty, that there's no obvious way in the contemporary ideas. There's no guide to do that. And there's no body of thought, because the dominant tendencies of thought are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. So then the last thing I want to say, by way of setting the stage for the argument of the course, is to clarify my perspective, the standpoint from which I want to engage these issues. So first, I want to engage them with a focus on the idea element, because that's our comparative advantage here. Ideas don't change the world all by themselves, but without ideas, you can't change the world. And the whole focus here falls on the ideas. Now, the second feature of the perspective is that it's about the world. So politics is primarily fought out in the theater of the nation state. The nation state remains the main setting of political struggle. But here, in this setting, I want to take the problem of the dictatorship of no alternatives and of its overthrow as a worldwide problem. I don't believe in merely local heresies. It's like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. I believe in universalizing heresies. And they ought to be more feasible now than they were then, because the world is much more connected now than it was then. It's a chain of analogies, of analogous problems and solutions throughout the world. And progress in one part of the world represented in the language of a powerful doctrine could resonate sensationally throughout the world. Now, the third element of the perspective from which I propose to address these problems is the normative element. And it will shadow all of our arguments through the semester. And I just want to say a few things by way of introducing the perspective that I propose. So in the terms of contemporary ideological debate, established in the second half of the 20th century, the division between left and right is a division with respect to the priority accorded to freedom or equality. So who is the right? The right are the people who think freedom first. And who's the left? The left is the one who thinks equality first. But now there's something very strange about this construction of the ideological debate, which is that in the discourse of these late 20th century, early 21st century progressives and leftists, the egalitarian faith is combined with an institutional skepticism or agnosticism. So they don't propose institutional alternatives. And by default, they accept the existing institutions. So take as an example of this the Anglo-American theories of justice, of distributive justice, in the Anglo-American academies. They're very, on the surface, they're very radical because they affirm the primacy of equality. But what is their actual function and content? It seems to be a philosophical or pseudo-philosophical justification of compensatory redistribution under social democracy. So who gets what after the fact through progressive taxation or social entitlements? There's no imagination of changing the structure of anything. the organization of politics, the organization of the economy, which is the real content of transformative politics. So when the egalitarian faith is combined with this institutional skepticism or agnosticism, its pragmatic residue, its real content, is the justification of after-the-fact redistribution. So there's egalitarian faith, and there are no structural ideas. That's the contemporary normative perspective. That wasn't the perspective of the liberals and the socialists in the 19th century. Their idea is that the fundamental aim of the progressives was to make people bigger. It was a shared bigness. To expand the scope, the intensity, the capabilities of ordinary human existence, to bring it to a higher plane. That was the objective. The objective was greatness. The central idea in politics is the idea of greatness. And the struggle against inequality is subsidiary to that higher ideal. And the greatness, instead of being the greatness of an elite, is the shared greatness of humanity brought up to a higher plane. And the instrument, the method, was some institutional formula. So each faction of the progressives, the liberals, the socialists, the different kind of socialists, had a different formula. It's the system of private rights. It's the state control of the economy. It's self-management and so forth. They each had a formula. Now, in this contest between the 20th century and the 19th century, I want to take the side of the 19th century. But in a qualified form, because like them, I want to argue that the aim of the progressives, the fundamental aim, is the elevation of human life. It's this shared bigness. Inequality has to be diminished, but the struggle against inequality is entirely tributary to this larger goal. And the method is the method of structural change through institutional innovation. But the idea that the 19th century liberals and socialists had of greatness was much too limited. It was an idea formed on the aristocratic model of self-possession. And their method was entangled in a series of dogmatic superstitions. So what's our problem now? We need structural alternatives. But unlike these liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we can't and shouldn't bring ourselves to believe in these dogmatic institutional formulas. How are we going to have structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism? That is a problem without precedent in the historical experience of humanity. It's a unique problem. It's our problem. It's a problem that we have for the first time in the history of politics and of political ideas. And the practical implication is that a crucial attribute of the institutional alternatives is that somehow they have to allow us to find the way along the way. They have to be corrigible in the light of experience. They can't be some definitive formula to which we will deliver ourselves. Well, so my whole intention just in this first class has just been to set the stage. And I think, thinking back over what I've said in this class, I just draw your attention to the following psychological paradox that you might say that this evocation of the situation of the progressives is dispiriting, because I've described their predicament as being a predicament of total disorientation, of loss. But my sentiment is just the opposite, that this is a circumstance with extraordinary transformative possibility. And that if we see it as a whole, in all of its aspects, it represents something wonderful. And now, so this is the perspective about the historical moment and how I see us. So there's been this revolutionary project in the world for the last 200, 250 years. And you know, it's had two main wings. It's had a political wing of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And it's had a personalist wing, which is the Romantic culture, the worldwide popular Romantic culture. And it set the world in flames. It set fire to the world. And we now are living in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And in this counter-revolutionary interlude, the revolutionaries, the progressives, no longer know what the next steps of that project should be. So the project is paradoxically strong and weak at the same time. It's the strongest project in the world because it's the project that commands the agenda. And all the other projects in the world react to it. But at the same time, it's a weak project because